Africa and in India. Over the next 15 years, about 1.2 billion people in the global south, predominantly in these two regions, will enter the job market. Only about 400 million of them are going to find formal employment. That leaves a gap of 800 million. And Vimal is right. AI and automation are going to create both job losses as well as create new opportunities. So we don't know exactly how it will play out. But overall, this is not just a development emergency, it's one of the defining global challenges of our time, right up there with climate change. Why? Because jobs are the key to prosperity. Recently, Ajay Banga, the World Bank president, said, and I quote him, he says, "The best way to put a nail in the coffin of poverty is to give a person a job. And we must find a way to create jobs and give hope to young people, otherwise instability is inevitable." So anyway, this, as I said, is one of the big challenges out there. And that's why after many decades leading large corporations, about 7 years ago I decided to focus on this central question. How do we create good jobs at scale in these regions? And I came very quickly to the conclusion that the biggest pathway is actually what I call mass entrepreneurship. And this is not your elite venture capital-backed tech startups and unicorns. It's millions of ordinary people starting millions of ordinary useful businesses, each of which creates a handful of jobs, some of which grow up to become Bidco. Prime Minister Modi of India, a few years ago, he put it very succinctly. He says, India has to become a nation of job creators, not job seekers. Only then will we be successful. So the question for me is, look, how do you do this? Has it ever been done before? Can we learn from another country? Can we go back in history and learn from it? And I was very lucky because quite soon after I started my journey, I was introduced to one of the world's greatest economists, Ned Phelps, who won the Nobel Prize in 2006. And Ned's work over the last 30 years has been in an idea that he calls mass flourishing. So he looks at why do some countries suddenly break out and become prosperous? And in particular, he focused on Britain in the 18th and 19th century, and America in the 20th century. And in both instances, what he found was very important and very interesting. He said the prosperity didn't happen because the governments there got their act together and enacted a bunch of reforms and so forth. For reasons we don't fully understand, in both these countries, there was a shift in cultural values. They began to value creativity. They began to value entrepreneurship. They began to value tinkering and invention. And so more and more ordinary people started tinkering, improving, and inventing things. Now, naturally, most of these things were small things, but a few of them were just world-changing inventions, like the steam engine, or the automatic spinning loom, or electricity and the light bulb. And the most important and exciting thing is these things were not invented by elite, university-educated engineers or MBAs. They were largely illiterate people, and that includes James Watt, Thomas Edison, Isaac Singer, and so on. And so as more and more people started tinkering, inventing, starting businesses, prosperity surged. And so this is what he calls mass flourishing, and his main point is prosperity did not primarily rise from top-down government efforts. It was a bottom-up revolution that occurred despite, again I go back to you, lots of constraints, inadequacies in governments, but it led to the government eventually joining hands. Now let's go to China. So the experience in China provides further confirmation of this thesis. There's a professor, very good professor at Cornell University called Victor Ni, And he's written an extraordinary book called Capitalism from Below. And he details how entrepreneurship exploded in the Yangtze Basin. And he says, look, we tend to think in China the transformation happened because of state-directed policies. But he points out, at least in the initial decade, it happened despite the government. He shows that the economic transformation of China was a bottom-up process of thousands of private entrepreneurs, resilient, driven, and they overcame lots and lots of challenges, including opposition from the government. And they did this by forming informal networks using what the Chinese term is guanxi, relationships. And they succeeded despite all the odds. And as more and more of them became successful, the government could no longer ignore them. So they joined the game. And then you began the top-down process of policy reform as well. So again, first bottom-up, then top-down. I see many friends from the Indian IT industry, like Raman. And all this stuff resonates so powerfully with us. So I was a small part of the IT revolution in Bangalore during these 25 years. India's IT success began in the early 1990s, again in the same way. A few extraordinary entrepreneurs who overcame lots and lots of difficulties and odds to start great companies like Infosys and Wipro. And then their success inspired more entrepreneurs. Then seminal thing happened. They all got together, we all got together, and we formed an incredibly effective industry association called NASSCOM. And so what we were able to do is, despite our competitive natures, we were able to come together and work with the government to enact some of the most important policy reforms around creating special economic zones, incentives, tax incentives for exports, investments in creating the connectivity infrastructure, high-speed internet, and so on. And that's when the place exploded, particularly after Y2K. Today, the city where I live is the epicenter of innovation and entrepreneurship, not only in India, the whole world. Our population has exploded from 2 million to 14 million, and along with that, all our traffic jams and problems. And the GDP of Bangalore alone today exceeds that of Kenya. So we have lived through this, and again, first bottom up, then top down. I was talking about this last night with a few of you at another event, and a distinguished gentleman in the front stood up and said, look, I agree with you. I've lived through it. My forefathers came to Kenya as indentured laborers. The British brought us here to build the railroads. And guess what? We had not heard of the word mass entrepreneurship. We didn't look for anything from the government. We just used our relationships to help each other and started many small businesses. And today, there are companies like Bitco, like Dr. Manisha, whose hospitality we are enjoying today, and so on. So you don't have to look far away to see these lessons. They're right here under our noses. And I think this work of Phelps is incredibly empowering because it points out that the key to prosperity lies in unleashing the creativity of our population. And so if you look at Africa, as again in your opening remarks you said, youth aspiration, creativity, hustle, these things are abundant and it's evident. I came to Nairobi about a few days ago and I walked around. It's there, very manifest in the streets, the informal economy. You go to Nigeria, it expresses itself as Nollywood, and the fintech success of Ghana, and so on. So, the spirit is there, but what we have is colonial legacies, education systems that don't really encourage creativity, and regulation that is often crushing. So, as a result, not many people are actually expressing themselves in these ways. Too many of us are therefore looking for jobs that don't exist or waiting for the government to do something. And so we need to flip the script. As I pointed out, governments do matter, but only after local initiative kicks off. Africa will flourish when it unshackles the creativity of its people and when more and more people feel empowered to solve the problems around them. One of the most important things to understand about our 21st century is there are going to be fewer and fewer formal jobs, but there are going to be more and more problems that need fixing, every one of which is an opportunity for an entrepreneur to go build a business around it. So, about 6 years ago, I started an organization called GAME, and GAME stands for the Global Alliance for Mass Entrepreneurship. And we've been trying to figure out, how do you make this happen at scale in India? And we've tried in these 6 years many things. So my co-founder has done something absolutely spectacular. Starting with the state of Delhi, he created an entrepreneurship curriculum, which is now compulsory for grades 9 to 12 in every government school in 13 states. So this morning, in 10,000 government schools, 1.5 million kids studied entrepreneurship in a practical way. And then in the summer holidays, the government gives them each about 1,500 shillings, and they have to get together in groups and launch a business. It's not a business plan. You have to actually launch and run a business. And so our hope is by 2030, every young person will grow up thinking of entrepreneurship not just as a career choice, but as a life skill. In the 21st century, entrepreneurship is a life skill, not a career choice. Then again, in all our countries, ease of doing business is something that we could definitely improve. And so we decided to actually work with one of the big states, the state of Punjab, to see, can we actually, when we get a positive government, can we actually work together to make a dramatic improvement in the regulations? And so we decriminalized 300 laws. We made huge improvements in simplifying the labor laws, which were onerous, and so on. And this work is now spreading to other states. We worked with many state governments and the central government to introduce credit schemes for first-time women entrepreneurs and youth entrepreneurs, and so on. But there's a small problem. All of this worked on the margin, but nothing really moved the needle in terms of massive job creation or lots of new business activity. Why? So this really perplexed us and our funders, because these were programs. Whenever government support ended or funding ended and we stepped away, everything stopped. We didn't create ownership, we didn't shift mindsets, and we didn't change the system. And I don't feel bad standing up here in such a distinguished audience and admitting that after 6 years, we really hadn't succeeded. But because in 2019, when Bill Gates was asked, hey, you spent $10 billion fixing education, what have you learned? He said, mostly I've learned that it's really hard, and mostly I've learned what doesn't work. And that's where we were last year. Then the light bulb came on, when we realized the critical importance of what is called place or city. It is Africa that gave the world the phrase, it takes a whole village to raise a child. And it's a perfect metaphor for entrepreneurship. It takes a healthy local ecosystem to raise healthy businesses. And these ecosystems are hard to replicate, which is why what works in Silicon Valley or Bangalore doesn't work in the next city. They're very, very hard to replicate. And that's because the critical factor is not policies and playbooks. It's trust, it's networks, it's ownership. And these soft things are hard to create. So if you want to create a healthy local ecosystem, what we learned is you have to create genuine ownership amongst key stakeholders. Who are the key stakeholders in a city? It's the local business people, it's the government, it's the bankers, it's the colleges. All these people have to own this agenda and begin to step out of their narrow self-interest, their silo, and start working together to improve things. And that's unnatural, because in a city like Nairobi or Bangalore or wherever, we all live in our own silos, and therefore the problem continues to exist. Sometimes it gets worse, and each person tries to solve it and cope with it the best they can. We needed to find a solution to this. And we started searching. And for all places, we found the solution in Colombia, South America, in a city of 500,000 people called Manizales. So in 2012, Manizales was a failing city. It had, the businesses that were closing down, tax revenues were declining, crime and unemployment were increasing, more and more frequent power cuts. I think we all recognize the signs. And that's when a professor from Harvard Business School called Dan Eisenberg started working with the city, using one of the local institutions as a partner. And they were able to bring together all these different actors I talk about to start working on these issues. And I call it basically creating a Rotary Club for entrepreneurship. So over the next 8 years, they achieved something that was quite impressive. By 2020, 250 small businesses were put through an accelerator. 70% of these businesses increased sales by over 30% a year. 2,100 new businesses started. All college students were put through an entrepreneurship curriculum. And as more and more businesses started growing faster and faster, more and more jobs were created, and more new entrepreneurs began to enter. And the mindsets of everybody, including the government, began to change, including the gas and electric utility began to change. And today this failing city is #1 in Colombia in social progress, #1 in Colombia in ease of doing business, and #5 in innovation. So Manizales succeeded by doing one thing. They focused everybody relentlessly on one thing, helping more and more firms grow faster and faster, creating more and more jobs and more new entrepreneurs, and of course more and more tax revenues. I keep using this phrase over and over again because how do you tell when a city is thriving? This is how you tell that it's thriving. So we started working with Professor Eisenberg and said, can we replicate this in India? And we started working in a city called Nagpur, 3.5 million people in the center of India. And we've been working there for about 18 months. And we've brought together, again, about 25 of these key stakeholders. We formed something called the Nagpur Entrepreneurship Mission. And what they've done is formed working groups around a few key issues. So we have one working group that's trying to build a world-class, world-scale plant protein cluster. Then we have a working group trying to facilitate electronics manufacturing. Another one that's trying to create entrepreneurship SEZ, only for women entrepreneurs. Nirmala, you'll be happy to hear that. Then we're working with a partner called TLC, where we're taking existing businesses and trying to accelerate their growth. So we have a cohort of 100 businesses that are on a path to being 10x in the next few years. And more and more people are getting involved. It's still very early days, so I'm not going to claim victory, claim a lot of success and results. But it's slow going because we have to change mindsets. But already what we're seeing is more and more leaders are emerging, more and more collaboration is happening. And now we're engaged in replicating this in 4 more states. And our moonshot goal is, can we get, in the next decade or so, 200 new cities becoming entrepreneurial hotspots, like Bangalore and Gurugram and so forth. So look, let me wrap all this up with a call for action, right? My message is very simple and very urgent, which is this youth unemployment crisis that we have in the global south. It's massive, but it's solvable. Let's not wait for governments to act, right? Instead, let's get going and draw them in. Sometimes they jump on board early, sometimes they take a while to get on board. Let's not wait for foreign firms and investors. Let's get our own people activated. Let's start with what's already bubbling up and working, and amplifying the entrepreneurial spirit and sparks that already are there. And this is where I have excitement about Africa-India ties. Indian companies, investors, entrepreneurs, we all have a natural affinity and affection for Africa. I feel completely at home anywhere in this continent. And I think many of us, including those who are coming for the first time, also do. And that's why the business ties are growing. The FDI between the countries is now over 100 billion. But there's a far greater opportunity in channeling technology, in channeling business models, and catalytic capital into our SME backbone. And I think with the right leadership from both sides, this corridor can become the world's most dynamic corridor for growth. And those of you who've known me for some time know I'm not a talker, I'm a doer, And so I didn't come here, I told Baljinder to give a speech, although I'm giving one. I came here to meet fellow leaders and doers. We'd love to partner with visionary leaders in this room to try and see if we can create similar, dynamic ecosystems across the continent. And so if you care deeply about creating jobs, unleashing your youth, transforming your cities, let's talk. This is our time, and we are the leaders who must make this happen. Thank you very much.
Everybody go to our breakfast.
Thank you so much, Ravi. We've got big things to do. So this is a do conference, not a talk shop. We've got plenty to do, and I think it's in taking hands together, finding common connections, finding common value, and being clear in our path that the change begins to start happening. If you are following the program, we've made a slight adjustment. I think it makes sense to make the adjustment, and I agree with making the adjustment. So I'm going to call up two incredibly esteemed gentlemen to come and have a conversation amongst friends that we might get to eavesdrop and listen to.